We came from Izmir today, and last night some of you went to see the ruins over there at the Agora, which is the marketplace in Izmir. Izmir, Smyrna, ancient Smyrna. And of course, you probably know the story of St. Polycarp and his martyrdom, where right around 150 AD he was martyred there in Smyrna because he refused to worship Caesar. Smyrna was a huge Caesar worship capital. In fact, it kind of wrote the book on worshiping Caesar for Asia Minor, even though it's spread out all over the place. And you're going to actually find a lot of that up here. I'll point it out before we conclude the study. But Polycarp just wouldn't worship Caesar. He's put on trial, arrested. He's a very old man. And you probably have heard the account where he's standing before the magistrate who's about to condemn him, and all he has to do is renounce Christ. And he said, for 86 years, he's never renounced me. Why should I betray him? I'm paraphrasing what he said. And for 86 years, that means he may have been a Christian for 86 years, or he may have been 86 years old. Either way, he was a very old man. And of course, there are legends about how he died, but essentially they tried to burn him at the stake. The wind blew the fire out. They lit it again. It wouldn't burn him, even though the fire burnt. So somebody said, stab him. They stick a spear in his side, hit an artery, blood puts out the fire. I mean, this is sort of, embellished, obviously, but he did die there. He was a faithful martyr to the Lord, and he was John's disciple, the Apostle John. So he knew the Apostle John back then. That's how we know who Polycarp is, because he was the next one in line. But in Smyrna, they faced lots of persecution because they wouldn't worship Caesar. And Jesus says to them, and I'm just going to read that letter here because it makes it easier than trying to read it there. You can see, as you try and put a tour together, the dynamics of Izmir or Smyrna is a little bit difficult, but you can make it work. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. When Jesus says something like that, you know he's getting very serious about what's about to happen to you. He's encouraging you. I died, I came back to life. It's going to happen to you too. Here it comes. He says, I know your afflictions. Those are the persecutions. And remember yesterday at Ephesus under the arches? I know your poverty. You see, nobody would buy from them. Nobody would sell to them. I know your poverty. They're not just a group of poor people across the board as Christians. They can't buy anything. They can't sell anything. They're starving them out. I know your poverty. Yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Once again, this is not an indictment of Jews in particular. This is an indictment mainly of the Jewish leadership of that particular synagogue, who were apparently, and this is best guess, in league with the Romans in order to starve out the Christians, because they had now become by this time a serious competition to them, and they didn't like what was going on messianically. They didn't want anything to do with Jesus as the Messiah and all of that. And the Christians, of course, gaining all this popularity with the Gentiles because they didn't have to become Jews first. They're bringing Gentiles in the church. These guys are angry, and Jesus says, they're not a synagogue of the Lord. They have nothing to do with me and what they're doing. They're actually working against me. They're a synagogue of Satan. And when Jesus uses that expression, synagogue of Satan, please remember what Satan means. Accuser. And these people are being accused. So they're acting in the stead, as it were, of the devil, accusing these people of not worshiping the emperor, not burning that pinch of incense. He says, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. That is an incredible statement, because right there I would kind of be afraid, well, what's going to happen to me? But when we remember who it is that's saying it, that's why Jesus personally dictates this letter and doesn't say, John, say this for me. No, Jesus says, John, I want you to give them my exact words. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Well, he suffered more than all of us. If I tell you the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. That's a short time, by the way. That's what it means by 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Ron Dozler pointed this out, and of course I remember this from before, but the coins in Smyrna had that laurel wreath crown that you saw in the hand of the bas-relief of Nike yesterday at Ephesus, holding that crown that crowns the victor, the same crown that we saw on the sculpture, the bas-relief at the foot of the obelisk there at the Hippodrome in Istanbul. Same thing. It's the victor's crown, the one that wins. There are different crowns in the Bible. There are crowns of royalty and all of these things. You know, we sing the hymn that I will sing with the glittering crown upon my head. There will be something like that in heaven. I don't know what it'll look like, but it'll even be better than that. But in the meantime, the laurel wreath crown is the same one that's constantly emphasized in the Bible by Jesus, by Paul, all of that. You have run the race, and you've run it and won it. You finished the race. You've won the race. You ran to win, and the crown is placed on your head. You ascend up, as it were, the steps, as we talked about when we were in the Hippodrome and we saw it on that picture. And so Jesus is saying, I'll do that. He says, to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. You die, I will personally crown you. I just like that. It's beautiful. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death or the last judgment. The last judgment will not apply to you. You will see it, but you will not be standing there in judgment. And then to the next church, this one. Hello, Church of Pergamum. Here you sit today and stand today. These to the angel in the church of Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp double-edged sword. That sword is not a combat sword. This sword is a judgment sword. It's like a beheading type of a thing. A man who can do execution. And Jesus says, I've got the execution sword. I know where you live. Where Satan has his throne. Now this has become a big question. What in the world does he mean by that, where Satan has his throne? We'll get to that. And yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. Once again, the accuser. Satan the accuser, where the accuser has his throne. He's put to death in your city where the accuser or Satan lives. And yes, it's a satanic thing. We're not just doing a play on words. It's demonic, it's satanic. But the function of Satan, don't forget, it's not what does it mean, it's what does he do in this case? What is he for? Well, he's the accuser. Okay, this is the place where Satan lives. And you're going to suffer here like his faithful witness Antipas. Now, Antipas, we really don't know anything about this man. He's kind of like, even though we have his name, it's like the Tomb of the Unknowns in Arlington, a person known only unto God. We just don't know much more about him, except that church tradition holds that he was roasted to death inside of a bronze bull. They stuck him in a bull, they closed a grate on it, and then they put a fire underneath it, and they just rotated him around until he was roasted alive. It's a horrible way to die. So this is how Antipas, even in those days, stayed faithful to the Lord. He wouldn't do what? He wouldn't worship Caesar. It's not only that he wouldn't worship idols, he wouldn't worship Caesar. Where Satan has his throne. Okay, first of all, right over this edge here, which you'll see in a little while, you'll take a break and you'll do that, you'll see where the altar of Zeus was. And as you know, it's in Berlin, but it has these gods, that are, half their body is a serpent, and then they're morphing into, stronger gods and that sort of thing. Plus, it was pointed out, somebody said the right thing. They said it looks like a triclinium. You walk up the steps, but you're surrounded by the temple itself, and these are like the gods, the important people on the outside looking at the slaves or the servants on the inside as you're walking up the stairs. So it makes you feel, important that you're worshiping the gods, but little because they're bigger than you. So Satan being, described as a serpent in Genesis, is that what Jesus means here? That he's like a snake that's on the altar of Zeus? You have nice, hymns in the background here. Isn't that cool? Yeah. When we're in Israel, the Nigerians light up sometimes, and wow, you just have to stop and wait because it's magnificent. Anyway, so here we are. You've got that maybe at the altar of Zeus, where Satan has his throne. Maybe it's that. Or maybe it's the temple of Asclepius, which is down here, which is a whole complex. It's like a hospital complex, where that if you were sick, you would go into that temple and the priest would direct you around. You would lay down in a big long tunnel, and they had live snakes in there. They were non-venomous, but they're all over the place. And if a snake brushed up against you, then that was a good sign. It was a good omen, and that you would get healed. And one of the columns that they used to have right out in front of the temple of Asclepius actually had what looked to be, well, it had a serpent that sort of serpentines right down the column. Now they moved it to a museum, but Asclepius is what's on our medical standards. It's not the serpent on the pole that Moses had, or the Nehushtan, the thing of brass, but it's actually from Asclepius, and you know this by the Hippocratic Oath. I don't know if any of you here are doctors. You know, doctors tend to keep that to themselves, like cops and lawyers. They don't tell you what they do because they get all kinds of weird questions when you tell them, right? But you take an oath, and in that oath, it names all these different pagan deities and things, and one of them is Asclepius, and it has to do with that symbol. And one of the biggest temples in the entire empire was down in that direction for people to get healed. So maybe it was that, because they're using pagan means to somehow become healed. Or maybe it's something else. This area of Pergamum, even though Smyrna was the center of Caesar worship, the temples here brought it to a high art, because if you worshipped the emperor here on the summit of Pergamum in this Acropolis here, you had several different options. One of which was later on, after the time of John, up there, that beautiful white facade that you see up there is part of the temple of Trajan, the deified emperor, the god Trajan. And there were others. And there's another one too. Really the first one, and the first altar anywhere that anybody knows of, though there may have been earlier ones, to the god Augustus. You're sitting on it right now. That's the place. So if you were to burn a pinch of incense to a Caesar and you wanted it to be Augustus, you would come here to this structure, which was much larger and of course would have had a statue on it and everything else, and here you would have burned a pinch of incense and you would have declared Caesar is Lord. In case you hadn't noticed, in the book of Romans, Jesus said, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. A whole different dynamic that goes against everything that Rome was trying to get the Christians to do. And it's so interesting to me also that when you're in like the Hagia Sophia and places like that, that you see Jesus as Lord and emperors presenting him with gifts. The tables completely turned so that suddenly Jesus, even though the whole system of the church and Christianity, the way it was operating at the time, was rapidly corrupting and falling into all kinds of strange things, that still the tables had turned, and now Jesus was in effect Lord and acknowledged by the mosaics and the reliefs and everything else of that day. Well, nevertheless, Jesus goes on to tell the people in Pergamum, I have a few things against you. So, you know, you live where Satan lives. It could be a reference to the emperor. It probably was a reference to the emperor, possibly the people that were accusing people for not burning pinches of incense to the emperor, like the people in Smyrna. It's them, and they're not going to be able to buy anything or sell anything. They'll starve too. Satan the accuser. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You have people there that hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. Once again, we hear this at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, 2 of the 4 things that the council said, don't do this if you're a Gentile. Just stop being a pagan. And one of which, of course, was eating food sacrificed to idols. Listen, if you're going to eat meat in those days, where are you going to get the meat? You're going to go down to the meat market? Well, they did have those. But they tended to be very close to temples because a lot of the meat that you would eat was already a sacrificed animal from the temple, which is why Paul, in speaking to Gentile churches, or mostly Gentile churches, said if somebody puts meat in front of you and says nothing, eat it in good conscience. But if they say this was sacrificed to Zeus or somebody, he said don't eat it for the sake of both your consciences. Don't eat it. Refuse it. Because it's been sacrificed to a deity. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols because you're participating in worship. When you went to the temple in Jerusalem, not every offering was a burnt offering. When you offered things to God, many times the priests and you were able to eat that food. It was like, I get to go up and eat with God. I get to have a feast with him and partake with him. That was kind of the idea. Well, the pagans had the same sort of idea. And if you ate meat that was sacrificed to an idol, knowing that it was sacrificed to an idol, then you were committing idolatry. So for conscience sake, if they tell you this was sacrificed to an idol, don't eat it. If they say nothing, you kind of know where it came from. But it's like don't ask, don't tell. God gave us that freedom. If they don't tell you it was sacrificed to an idol, eat it and enjoy it. That's okay. But if you know it was, you don't do it. Well, here's this thing of Balaam. Now, this is the tricky part, and we'll wrap this up in just a minute. This thing of Balaam was, what is he talking about here? You know, you hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak and the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and committing sexual immorality. Well, you know the story, of course, where Balaam is called upon by the Moabite king Balak to curse the Israelites because Balaam is a known prophet of God, but he's an unscrupulous man. He's a mercenary and he'll sell himself as a prophet. Why did God use him that way? That's a whole other message. But the fact is, God did. And when he tries to curse the Israelite camp, only blessings come out of his mouth. Balak gets mad. Do it again. He tries it again. Only blessings come out of his mouth. Finally, after this process, Balaam says, look, I can't do this. These are his people, and God won't let me curse them. But here's how you get them. You send your sweet young things in among them, and of course, they will have immoral sex with them, and have them bring their idols with them, and it will compromise the camp, and God will get them. And that's what Balak says. That was Balak's teaching. Now, there's another time when Balaam is talked about, Balaam's teaching rather. There's another time when Balaam, it talks about the Balaam's greed, and that's a whole other subject. That's not in this context. What he was doing was he was just telling how to bring the place down. The teachings of Balaam, the people here in Pergamum are holding to this. It appears that the teachings of Balaam as it applied to the people in Pergamum, where they were saying, look, it's okay. You don't want to starve. You don't want to be disrespected by the people and pushed out. Yes, you're a Christian. They were accounted as Jews or with the Jews at that time. But go ahead and burn that pinch of incense. It's okay. And then you can just repent and it will be all right. It's not that big of a deal. Just kind of enter into this sort of a thing, which is what was being suggested, of course, by Balaam to Balak, where he finally did get to the children of Israel by doing exactly as Balaam suggested. So that is most likely the context of what's going on here. And Jesus is going after the Pergamese saying, stand your ground, because you're going to be tempted and tested. People among you are saying, just do it. It's going to be okay. It's not going to be a problem. Well, let's finish this up before we get baptized here. And you have others who hold to the teachings of the Nicolaitans, people that were probably more like Jezebel in, of course, the letter to Thyatira, who were tempting people to say, look, idolatry, it's okay. We want to make sure that we have good luck, good fortune. We have the stars on our side and what have you. Some people think the Nicolaitans is an early reference to people who were lording it over the laity, because that's exactly what it means. Conquering the laity, Nicolaitan, conquering just the people and lording it over. Maybe a false authority structure within the church, which what's happened to the authority structure within the church. It's become a mess over the centuries. And that could be what he's talking about as well. Repent, therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you, your church, and I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He's not going to take out everybody. Jesus is just, but he will go against those who are leading people either into the false worship of Caesar or perhaps the false worship of other idols, or both or all. Because there are some things in here we have some questions about, but those seem to be the best answers. And he says, I'm going to fight against them with the sword of my mouth. I'm going to judge them. And then he says this, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Listen up, everyone. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna. That's, of course, a symbol of Jesus, the bread of life, the bread that came down from heaven, where Jesus, remember, he said, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness, but they died. This is the bread that came down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. The hidden manna. Why hidden? Because it was in a jar inside the Ark of the Covenant, which in and of itself is a perfect symbol of Jesus. That's why you see it in heaven. The box isn't there. Jesus is there. He's everything the Ark of the Covenant was meant to represent. And in that box was the jar of manna, and that's Jesus, the bread of life, the miraculous bread of God that keeps you alive, in his case, forever when you take him. And then he says this, and this is what we finish with, I will also give him a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it. Okay, a white stone with a new name. What type of new name? And only you know it? This would be a name like God changing Jacob's name to Israel, or other names that he changed in the Bible. It could also be, when God did these things, of course, he changed people's names based on their character and the changes that he was making to their character. And so you could think of it almost like, and I don't want to degrade it at all, but think of it like a pet name. You know, he looks at you, and I would call my wife by a pet name. She's holding the camera right there, so I'm looking into the camera. But I would call her by a pet name because it characterizes the way that I know her, you see. So I'm not trying to anglicize this, but you can see that God kind of does this. He calls people, when he changes their names, by how he really knows them. And he says, I'll give you a new name known only to you. But what's this white stone thing? And here's the end. It could be that white stone, black stone. White stone, a vote yes. Black stone, a vote no. The Urim and the Thummim was thought to be like a white stone or a black stone, or possibly something else, but that's one of the theories about it. And white means yes, and black means no. White means voting yes, black means rejection, that sort of a thing, the way that people would vote in a binary fashion like an election. And it could be. I'm certainly not going to discount that. But there's another possibility in all of this. And actually there are several, but the one that sort of stands out is the one that I kept pointing out over and over again to Pastor Mike. Where are you? There he is. Pastor Mike's up there. Every time we'd walk by one of these bases, they're about that tall. They're flat on top, and DeLake pointed it out yesterday. You could see footprints on the top because they had statues of important people that had done marvelous things. Once again, a way to honor the heroic or the benevolent in a city. And they would create a statue of them, set them on a square pedestal, and carve in that pedestal who that person was and what they did. And that block was known as a white stone. And of course, God is not into images, into idols. Of course, we talked about that before. Images were the sort of the entrance into idolatry. Words were the entrance into faith. That's why the word and words of the scripture are so important. But even so, these people understood the concept of that. If you're represented on a white block, it had to be marble, it stood out, it was pure, it was something that looked magnificent, that you would be remembered by all. And I will give him a white stone. So yes, it could be a vote. You've got my vote. But in this particular context, you have acted heroically. You have been stalwart in the way that you have stood for me, and I will give you a white stone with your new name written on it, but only known to you, that represents the character of what you have been and done for me, the Lord is saying. And I think that's a very real possibility. And you'll see some of these up here in places, not these round ones here. These are just broken off columns. Something like that one there might be something like that. But you can always tell because it looks like it has two footprints in the top where a statue used to be. So there you go. Welcome to Pergamum. We were just in Smyrna. These people are under duress, and Jesus says, for the people in Smyrna, hang in there. And for the people in Pergamum, don't compromise. Don't burn that pinch of incense. Don't be sucked in by any temptation to try and say, I want to avoid this suffering by doing what somebody else tells you to do, because you will bring problems on yourself, and he's going to be behind that judgment. So watch out for that. So here we are. God bless you, Church of Pergamum, this day. Amen.